My name is Carlton Cartwright. I'm the Executive Director for Veterans Memorial and Multicultural Histories Incorporated. Today is Saturday, October 30th, 2021, and we are here at the Marriott World Center in Orlando, Florida. And sir, what is your name?
My name is Will Atkins.
Okay, Will. And Will, when is your birthday?
My birthday is May 18th, 1980.
And what city do you live in right now?
Right now I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Okay. And what branch of the service are you in?
Air Force.
Were you enlisted or were you drafted?
Neither. I'm an officer.
Okay.
Active duty volunteer.
Oh.
Neither enlisted nor drafted.
Okay, so how did you enter into the service?
I went through Air Force ROTC at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University.
And where is that at?
That is in Prescott, Arizona.
Okay. And what year was that?
I graduated in 2002.
What'd you major in?
The Air Force wanted me to major in electrical engineering.
But?
Well, so I did.
Oh, okay.
It was not by my choice.
Not by
choice. They gave me a
choice.
scholarship for electrical engineering.
They gave you one?
They did.
Okay, so they paid for your school?
They did.
Oh, nice. Where were you living at that time?
At the time,
Yeah.
I was living in West Palm Beach, Florida.
And what were you doing before you went into service? Student?
Yeah, I was a student, high school student, college student, and then as soon as I graduated from college, went right into service.
Okay, nice. All right, where'd you go to, where was OTS?
So I went to, our version of field training was at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas.
Right, and how long was that?
It was only 4 or 5 weeks.
Okay, and your MOS or AFSC?
So when I commissioned, I was a 12M3B, which is a C-130 Navigator, and then I went right into our tech school training for C-130s.
Okay, so, you went to Navigator School first, right?
That's right.
How long was that?
So Nav school was about a year.
Where?
Also in San Antonio. This was at Randolph Air Force Base.
Okay, all right. And Texas?
In Texas.
Right, and after that, you went where now?
So right after Nav school, then I had follow-on training at Little Rock Air Force Base in Arkansas to learn how to be a navigator on a C-130.
And how long was that training?
That one was 4 or 5 months.
Okay. So, did you decide to get in the RR before you went to your next base, or had you gone home during this time? On break or anything?
No, I left straight from college and went to Randolph for Nav school and then Little Rock for C-130 school, and very seldom was I ever home, maybe for a couple of days for holidays or something like that, but no real extended stays.
Right, okay. All right, so after, both schools, you're an officer now. What rank were you at the end of school?
So I was still a second lieutenant when I finished C-130 school in Little Rock.
Right.
So I reported to my first operational duty station, which was Yokota Air Base, Japan, still as a second lieutenant.
How long were you there?
I ended up at Yokota for 3 years.
Okay. And what were your duties there, and how was it, and what were the people like on the economy?
So Yokota was probably my favorite assignment the whole time that I was in, that I've been in. So I started as just a line navigator. We would fly the line a couple of times a week. I started out as we'd call him a duty dog, sitting at duty desk, answering the phone, answering questions, driving people out to aircraft, things like that.
Right.
I became an executive officer for the commander, a central scheduler for the unit, and really, learned how to fly the C-130, learned how to do my job. What the Air Force was all about was everything at that first unit. Japan was amazing. We traveled to essentially every country in the Pacific Theater. Lots of exercises, military exercises across the Indo-Pacific region. It was a really good time. I don't think I knew what I had while I was there. I was a young second lieutenant, became a first lieutenant while I was there. I didn't leave base as much as I should have. I needed to get out in the local economy more. Did a little bit of traveling around though, but looking back, wish that I had done more.
Okay. Okay. Up to this point, were there any casualties through through any of your training, and in this 2-year stint? Any casualties? Any
No.
fatalities?
No, nothing like that. At one point I had to go through water survival at Pensacola Naval Air Station, and there was a chute malfunction where while someone was under parachute, their harness had malfunctioned and they dropped quite a ways to the water. Ended up being okay, but that was the first incident where someone kind of got hurt in the line of duty, and it was I ended up having to then go do that particular thing 2 or 3 people later, and there were a couple of people who said that was it, they weren't going to do it. It was part of our aircrew training, so when people opted out of it, they were told essentially you're giving up your wings, you won't get to fly. And for a couple of people, they said, yep, seeing that was enough, I don't want to do it anymore. For me watching it, I mean, it was scary, but it was not enough, so I guess, to give up my wings over.
Okay. So where was your next duty station after Yokota?
So after Yokota, I went to a joint guard active duty base in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was half Air National Guard, half active duty. The Guard owned the aircraft, and then the active duty provided half of the air crew to fly them. At the time, there just weren't enough C-130 aircraft actively flying, so they felt like we could utilize the Guard's planes perhaps more than the Guard was flying them by giving them more air crew.
Okay.
At the very end of my tour in Japan, my director of operations and commander had asked me if I wanted to become a weapons officer, and that was kind of the natural progression for me as aircrew. I flew the line for a little while. I became an instructor while I was still a first lieutenant. I became an instructor navigator, and then the next step after that is weapons officer. The weapons school is essentially the Air Force, they call it like the PhD of tactics, how to fly your aircraft tactically. So as soon as I got to Cheyenne, Wyoming, I was only there for a couple of months, and then I had to go, I got to go through the weapons school as a student. We compare it, the Navy has their famous Top Gun. It's the Air Force version of Top Gun. We have a good rivalry with the Navy Top Gun program. They come to our graduation exercise, so we say that we must be better if they come to us. But the Top Gun program is only 6 weeks long, or at least at the time. So they like to say that they must be much smarter than us because they graduate in 6 weeks, and it takes us 6 months to go through our program. So almost as soon as I got to Cheyenne, I went through the weapons school as a student. 6 months there, some of the hardest training, but the most rewarding flying I've done. So I graduated from there, went back to my unit in Wyoming, and then finished out that tour as I was a tactics officer because I was a weapons officer, and then I became the assistant director of operations there.
And how long did you do that?
I was in Cheyenne for 3 years. So 6 months at the weapons school, then the other 2.5 years in the unit in Cheyenne.
Okay, so apparently that up to this point you've had a relatively, it's been a great career.
It was good. Everything was normal up until that point. Everything was
Uh-oh.
everything was a natural progression. You know, you get your aircraft, you learn how to fly it, you get better at flying it, you become an instructor, you become a weapons officer, you become an evaluator. Everything was kind of set, and the next steps just kind of came naturally.
Okay. So now you in a new position, and did you stay where you're at for the next segment, or did you move on to did you get orders to go somewhere else?
So after that, I got orders to go to Little Rock Air Force Base for another 3 years, and they had invited me back to the weapons school as an instructor. So about 2 years after I graduated as a student, I came back to teach there. And it was really interesting to see it from the other side. I only saw from the student side. I never got to see what the instructors went through. And it was just as difficult, just in a different way on the instructor side. You're up before the students, you go to bed after the students, long days, hard flying, that sort of thing.
Right.
After about 2 years, though, I was selected for major, and they wanted to give me some leadership opportunities. So they moved me over to the operations group Stanival office as the chief navigator there. In doing so, I changed MAGCOMs from Air Combat Command to Air Mobility Command. And within 3 months of that shift, it was just down the street on base, but a shift in MAGCOMs. I was non-voled into what's called the AFPAC hands, Afghanistan-Pakistan hands. The program was designed to teach us language skills. I ended up learning both Pashto and Dari. And we were supposed to do long-term deployments to Afghanistan, to be air advisors and advisors to Afghan counterparts. And it was just it came out of nowhere. It had nothing to do with flying C-130s. In fact, the Afghans fly C-130s, some C-130s that we gave them, and I asked them, since I'm a C-130 weapons officer, can I teach the Afghans to fly? And they said no, that's not the position we have for you. But the whole thing was just very, like I said, out of the blue, nothing to do with my career field. So it was really a hard turn that just really changed my entire career from that point on.
Okay. All right, so what's the next step in your progression?
Yeah, so they chose me for AFPAC hands. They moved me up to the Pentagon in DC. It was kind of a placeholder. They needed an office to put me in, but I had about a year of pre-deployment training. As I mentioned, they taught me both Dari and Pashto, a lot about how to advise. I ended up becoming a political military advisor for Afghanistan. My first 1 year deployment as an AFPAC hand, my job was essentially to go to every Afghan Air Force base and ask them, how many airplanes do you have, and can I count them? And for whatever reason, that was a very sensitive topic. The Afghans did not want us to count their airplanes.
Right.
So I spent a year doing that sort of thing. I worked on it was called the CAT, the COM-ISAF Advisory and Assistance Team. And we were, at the time, the COM-ISAF was General Dunford. We were essentially his personal IG team. If General Dunford wanted something looked at, he would send the CAT to go look at it.
Right.
Like most IG teams, though, most people did not like us being there. They knew that we were inspecting them on something, and we were going to give information back to General Dunford. So it was a rocky deployment. My daughter she actually turned 1 the day that I deployed.
Okay.
That was when I was non-volatile for Afghans. My wife was pregnant. They wanted me to move to DC like the same week that she was born, and I had to go to my 06 colonel commander and say, please don't. The wife is giving birth right now. Please don't make us move. He was able to buy us about 2 months. So we moved to DC when my daughter was about 2 months old, and then I ended up deploying on her first birthday. And that was interesting for me. I had 4 deployments before then, flying C-130s, but I was always single at the time.
Right.
That was my first deployment with a family. I had gotten married, I had my daughter. So it was the longest deployment up until that point as well. So it was just different.
Right,
you know?
right.
So that year in Afghanistan ended. I was really glad to get home. At that point now my daughter is 2, and I had missed about half of her life, and all the first steps, first words, all that stuff was while I was gone.
Right.
So I came back. I was home for a year. During that, about 10 months, during that time I went to National Intelligence University. I got what ended up was my second master's degree. And then as soon as I finished school there, I went back to Afghanistan for another year. So then I was missing, my daughter had just turned 3. I missed from 3 to 4. That second year in Afghanistan was really interesting. So I was still a political military advisor, and I was advising the president of Afghanistan and the national security advisor for Afghanistan. I worked in the presidential palace, which was their version of the White House. I wore a suit and tie to work every day. It was a really very high level. I got to have some very high level strategic conversations about the war in Afghanistan, the direction it was taking, whether it was sustainable, all those sorts of things. There was an IED attack while we were there that was close enough to the presidential palace that it blew the windows out and had all of us diving for the floor. Everyone was okay, but that was the first time. I'm used to flying, so we've been shot at while flying before, but nothing. We might find a random bullet hole, but nothing in the aircraft. Nothing really major. So that IED attack was probably one of the first and one of the worst experiences that I had. We were in their version of the White House, so none of the Americans are allowed to be armed. So we didn't have any self-protection.
Wow.
So the IED goes off, the windows shatter, we're dive into the ground, and then all we can do is there's a kind of a safe room essentially in the palace, and we're like, I guess we're just running to the safe room.
Right.
So there's a little bit of helplessness, like you can't, I'm not armed, what could I do even if I wanted to?
Right.
And then there's a lot of, you had to trust our Afghan counterparts. They were the ones who were armed. They were the ones who were going to protect us. We didn't know at the time if the palace was being attacked or overrun, and we just kind of had to, listen to the Afghans and do what they told us to do, because we had no other choice. So that was an interesting assignment.
Casualties?
Not on our side. Some Afghans, some of the perimeter guard type folks, but that was one where shortly thereafter I kind of said I'm done. I can't do this. I I was missing half of my daughter's life, doing this advising job that was just so different than what I had expected my career to be. I thought I was going to fly forever. So it was towards the end of that year in Afghanistan that I applied to the Air Force Academy to go teach. I understood that the Air Force Academy was that you wouldn't deploy if you were stationed there, that you were needed to be a teacher. I love teaching. I love, in general, I love political science. By that point, I had a master's degree in political science. So I applied to teach political science at the Air Force Academy. And luckily, I got it. And I was excited to come home, to be done with that deployment. I knew we were going to go to Colorado Springs, which is a beautiful city. My wife and I both snowboard, so we're going to teach our daughter how to do it.
Right.
It was good. So I came home from the deployment, and we PCS to Colorado Springs, and within like 3 months of getting there, they said, you're on the short list to deploy. And I was like, man, how could I possibly be on the short list to deploy? I just did back-to-back 365s. Nobody does that.
Right.
And they said, well, we need an 05 weapons officer from the academy, and there were only like 2 of us at the time. And it was one of those, like, man, one of the big reasons why I chose to go to the academy was to not have to deploy, and yet here I am. So anyway, I mean, that I did not have to deploy again, but that has driven a lot of the decisions while I was at the academy.
Right.
My political science department asked if I wanted to go get a PhD, but I knew that would be 5 more years of service, and more than likely in that 5 years I would get called on to go deploy again.
Right.
And I didn't want to do it. So I turned down the PhD. I was offered a fallout slot at Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base. I turned that down because it would have meant an additional duty requirement, another 3 years or so. So I've kind of started turning down opportunities to just make sure that I didn't deploy again, so I could be at home with the family.
Right, that's really important, so I really get that. That's not an issue. Okay, so are you reserve or active duty now?
I am active duty right now.
Okay, all right, so how many years has it been total anyway?
Right now, I'm right at 19 years. I am going to drop retirement paperwork in a couple of months, and 1 year later, I will retire.
Okay. Okay, that was, where were you stationed at that, okay, so you were in the Middle East, and what year was that?
Which time? So
the last time you were talking about?
So the last time I was there was essentially 2015 through 2016.
Okay, so that was 5 years ago.
It was.
So what happened after that?
So I've spent the last 3 years teaching American government,
right?
Political science at the Air Force Academy. I teach primarily American government, so the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, how American government deals with national security policy making, that sort of thing. But I've also taught international security and campaigns and elections as well. Again, everything kind of changed when I went AFPAC hands and then started doing academic work. We just published a book. I'm a co-editor on a book called American Defense Policy. where we
Nice.
analyze American defense policy and how it gets made, and the issues and the threats that we see coming, and things that we should do in the future. I wrote one of the pieces for that book that talks about essentially black swans, unforeseen events.
What is a black swan?
So a black swan it's a term that was popularized by Nassim Taleb, who wrote a book called The Black Swan. These are unexpected events that no one saw coming. It's based on a historical story about how back in the day no one could have imagined that a swan could be black, that every swan they'd ever seen had been white. They just couldn't imagine it. So when someone did finally see a black swan, it surprised them that something could be like that. So when we talk about black swans, a lot of times in the defense industry, people say, well, was 9/11 a black swan? Was the COVID pandemic a black swan? And for a lot of people, they'll say it wasn't a black swan because people knew that something like that could happen. There had been chatter about terrorists hijacking aircraft. There had been chatter, a fear that a pandemic could be in the future. Bill Gates had been warning about a pandemic years before COVID hit. So there's another term then called gray rhinos, that you know what a gray rhino is, and you can see it off in the distance getting ready to charge.
Right.
And it's just whether or not you can do anything to get out of the way of the charging rhino. So I wrote this piece in the book about black swans and gray rhinos, and how the military can come up with better defense policy to deal with it. Black swans are truly unknown. You could never see them coming. But we have a pretty good idea what all the gray rhinos are. We know they're on the horizon. We're talking artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, China, Russia, more generally. At this point, pandemics. So we know these things are out there. It's just that we don't have a good process for coming up with policies that prepare to deal with these things.
So solution-wise, okay, so you took part, you co-authored this book or you wrote it?
So I'm co-editor of the book,
Okay.
and then I wrote a couple of the pieces within the book.
Uh-huh. Okay, so I'm just trying to figure, this is something you've observed, that you've had experience with, that
Right.
you're an expert on.
Right.
Okay. And do you know whether or not has it been well received?
So it just came out
Okay.
a couple of months ago.
Right.
It's designed to be a textbook for political science classes, national security classes, but really at the military academies. So West Point's considering adopting this textbook. We did adopt the textbook at the Air Force Academy.
Right.
And it's half of the book are seminal articles that have been in the literature for years that we felt needed some emphasis, and then the other half are original content that we wrote specifically for the book, dealing with things that we just hadn't seen written about enough before.
Okay. Okay, so the book is part of your process at the moment, and you've been teaching now for the last 5 years?
About 3 years now.
About 3 years? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's pretty much, this is a wrap on your
So it is.
on your military career.
It is. As I'm coming up on this last year of service, it's kind of the book, and then just some other writing that I do. So I like to relate national security and domestic politics to some
Right.
extent. I think that there's a lot of domestic policy that could be better served if we think about it as a national security issue. And the example I'll use is the pandemic, that while pandemic response and masks and vaccines, those are all domestic policy issues, but when the pandemic forces an aircraft carrier to not be serviceable, to, the first time since World War II that we had an aircraft carrier knocked out of service was because of COVID. A lot of these domestic politics, domestic policy issues can easily become national security issues as well. When we're talking about a lack of diversity in the military, when we're talking about climate change that's flooding Navy bases, the hurricanes that are hitting Air Force bases, a lot of these domestic policy issues have national security effects. And if we don't think about it from a national security point of view, and we let these issues fester without dealing with them, we could see some serious problems later on.
Okay, fabulous. That's very, it's more than interesting. Okay, just the last few questions.
Yeah.
How has the military affected your point of view in terms of war?
There's a quote, I have no idea who said it, something about how only people who have been to war know the importance of not going to war, something like that. That once you've seen it, there's always a fear that people in the military or military generals or whatnot would be warmongers, like they always want to go to war. I tend to believe, though, that those that have been at war are going to be the ones who argue against it the most. I mean, we've been there, we've seen it. It's not a decision that should be taken lightly. And the U.S. military has a pretty significant issue with mission creep, where we go in for one set of reasons, and we could use Afghanistan as an example. We went in to get rid of the Taliban and get Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. And we did that in about 3 months after 9/11. And yet 20 years later, we were still there. And it was all for good reasons. I mean, expanding access to education for women and girls, decreasing mortality rates for infants. I mean, these are all good things. It just wasn't the mission of the military, certainly not when we first got there. But in a lot of our operations, we have a mission creep. So I think that my personal view on war is, generally if we're going to go to war, we should not go for limited objectives. We should go all in, and we should have very defined and deliberate objectives that can be met, and then we can leave. I don't personally like the expansion of objectives to more and more things, and what we found is, especially in Afghanistan, we kind of won the war in the first 3 months, and there's this feeling that people looked at it and were like, well, that was pretty easy. Let's, what else can we do while we're here? Let's establish a democracy, and that objective is quite a bit harder than just ousting the Taliban.
Okay, and final question.
Sure.
How has the military affected your life? What has been the impact on your life? And how many years have you been in the military?
19 years now, and 20 years in one day, and I'll be done.
But nobody's counting.
And no one's counting. So, my grandfather served in the Army in Korea. And my dad, when I started looking at going to Air Force ROTC in college, my dad and I had this conversation. My dad didn't want to join the military because he moved around so much with my grandfather, and it was something he didn't want for me. I think that's been kind of how it has affected me the most is just how it's affected my family. That, the first 10 years or so as a single guy deploying, doing those sorts of things, it really wasn't that big of a deal. If it was just me, I only had me to worry about. Life changes a lot when suddenly you're married and you have a kid and you're worried about moving them all over the place, and, spouse having difficulty finding jobs. My daughter she's been in so she's 9 years old. I think she's been in 8 different schools. It's difficult to, everyone says they're fine and everything, everyone seems okay, but it's hard to imagine that not affecting someone, moving around that much, having your life kind of upended that many times. So I think for me, as I approach retirement, I have this desire for stability that I don't want to move, I don't want to deploy. I like routine and schedules, and whereas I think earlier in my life I would have been fine with more spontaneity or surprises. I think now I just want calm and normal. I want a 9-to-5 job, something I know what's coming next, and it's been interesting. So my daughter growing up with me in the military, at some point she may have that discussion of whether she wants to join the military, and I don't know that I would recommend it. The military will get their blood out of you. Like they'll squeeze you for all it's worth, and they provide benefits. They'll send you to school, they'll train you, they'll give you a steady job. But man, you have to be willing to give up quite a bit at the same time. So I don't know if my daughter ever came to me and said, I want to join the military. I don't know what I would say. I don't know.
Okay, well, on that note.
I mean, it's been a great life. I don't know.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
Believe me, I understand. I want to thank you for a great interview, and I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you
It's been my pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.